The morning shift at the private airport had started before sunrise. Ground crews moved between hangars, fuel trucks rolled across the tarmac, and technicians completed their final inspections before the day's flights. Every step followed a checklist because in aviation, small mistakes could have serious consequences. Daniel Brooks tightened the access panel beneath the left jet engine and checked the readings on his inspection tablet one last time. He had spent nearly 15 years maintaining aircraft, and he treated every inspection with the same care, whether the plane belonged to a small charter company or a multinational corporation. His blue coveralls were faded from years of work, and grease stained the sleeves despite repeated washing. To him, clean engines mattered far more than clean clothes. A few meters away, his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, sat quietly on a folding chair with a library book in her lap. She occasionally looked up, smiled at her father, and returned to reading. Since Daniel had become a single father, balancing work and parenting had not always been easy. When school was closed and childcare wasn't available, she waited patiently where airport staff knew her well. A black luxury sedan stopped near the aircraft. Ethan Carter, CEO of a fast-growing technology company, stepped out wearing a tailored suit. 2 senior executives followed behind him, discussing an important meeting scheduled in another city. As they approached the jet, Ethan glanced toward Daniel and slowed his pace. "He's working on our engine?" he asked, his voice carrying farther than he probably intended. One executive shrugged. "That's what the maintenance schedule says." Ethan gave a short laugh. "For what this flight costs, I expected someone who looked a little more professional." The remark drew a few uncomfortable smiles. Daniel heard every word but didn't react. He finished securing the panel, stood up, and calmly wiped his hands with a clean shop towel. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm completing the final safety inspection. We'll be finished shortly." Ethan barely acknowledged him. "Just make sure nothing delays us. We've got people waiting." Daniel simply nodded and returned to his checklist. Personal opinions came and went, but safety procedures never changed. Daniel continued his inspection without letting the earlier remarks distract him. He listened carefully as the engine completed its test cycle, watching the pressure and temperature readings on his tablet. Everything appeared normal at first, but one vibration value briefly rose above the acceptable range before returning to normal. It was a small fluctuation, easy to overlook if someone was rushing. But Daniel had learned long ago that unusual readings deserved a second look. He signaled to another technician to pause the boarding process. "I'm going to inspect the left engine again," Daniel said. "I want to confirm something." Within minutes, Ethan Carter noticed that passengers were no longer being allowed onto the aircraft. "What now?" he asked impatiently, walking toward the maintenance area. Daniel remained calm. "A sensor showed an irregular vibration. It may be nothing, but I can't approve the aircraft until I'm certain." Ethan folded his arms. "You're delaying an entire executive team because of a single number on a screen?" "I'm delaying the flight because that's my responsibility," Daniel replied. "If the inspection confirms everything is fine, you'll be on your way. If it doesn't, you'll be glad we checked." Ethan shook his head in frustration and muttered that some people enjoyed making simple jobs complicated. Daniel and another mechanic opened the engine access panel again. Using a flashlight, they inspected the mounting points and surrounding components. After several careful minutes, Daniel spotted the problem. One retaining fastener had worked slightly loose. It wasn't an immediate emergency, but leaving it unattended could have led to increased vibration and further damage during flight. The maintenance team replaced the part, completed another inspection, and ran a fresh engine test. This time, every reading stayed well within limits. Only after the results met every safety requirement did Daniel sign the release form. As the boarding resumed, Ethan watched from a distance. For the first time that morning, he realized the quiet mechanic hadn't delayed the flight to prove a point. He had done exactly what his job required, protecting everyone on board, even those who had shown him little respect. The passengers settled into their seats, and the aircraft departed safely after the maintenance delay. The meeting Ethan had been worried about started a little late, but it ended successfully. During the return flight that evening, however, he found himself thinking less about business and more about the mechanic who had refused to compromise on safety despite being mocked in front of everyone. When the jet landed back at the airport, Daniel was still on duty. He was completing paperwork in the maintenance office while Lily colored quietly at a nearby table. Ethan walked in, intending to offer a brief acknowledgement before leaving. "I suppose I owe you a thank you," he said. "If you hadn't insisted on checking the engine again, we could have had a much bigger problem later." Daniel smiled politely. "I'm glad everything worked out. That's what we're trained to do." As Daniel reached for a maintenance file, the sleeve of his coveralls slid back slightly. A faded tattoo became visible on his forearm. It wasn't decorative. It showed a small heartbeat line ending in a pair of tiny footprints, followed by a date. Ethan looked at it for a moment before quietly asking, "Does that tattoo mean something?" Daniel glanced down and gently pulled his sleeve higher instead of covering it. "My wife and I lost our first child before birth," he said softly. "A few years later, my wife became seriously ill and passed away. Lily was only 4 years old then." For a few seconds, the room was silent. "I kept the tattoo to remind myself that every day matters," Daniel continued. "When people trust an aircraft, they're trusting everyone who worked on it. I never want another family to experience a loss that could have been prevented." Ethan looked toward Lily, who smiled at her father without knowing what they were discussing. The confident CEO suddenly felt embarrassed by the assumptions he had made that morning. He had judged a man's value by his clothes, never imagining the strength, grief, and responsibility hidden behind a simple mechanic's uniform. Ethan stood quietly for a moment, unsure of what to say. The confidence he carried into every boardroom seemed to disappear inside the small maintenance office. Looking at Daniel and Lily together, he realized how little he actually knew about the people whose work made his own success possible. "I'm sorry," Ethan said at last. "This morning I judged you before I even knew your name. I was wrong." Daniel gave a small nod. "We all make quick assumptions sometimes. What matters is what we do after we recognize them." Lily packed her crayons into her backpack and walked over to her father. Daniel introduced her to Ethan, who smiled and greeted her warmly. She proudly explained that she wanted to become an aerospace engineer one day because she loved watching airplanes and asking her father how they worked. "That's a wonderful goal," Ethan replied. "Keep studying and don't stop asking questions." Over the following weeks, Ethan couldn't forget the conversation. At the next company meeting, he shared the experience with his leadership team, not to praise himself, but to admit his mistake. He reminded everyone that every successful flight depended on dozens of people whose names passengers would never know. Mechanics, cleaners, ground crews, dispatchers, and many others who quietly did their jobs with care. A month later, Ethan visited the airport again. This time, he walked straight to the maintenance hangar, shook Daniel's hand, and thanked the entire crew for their professionalism. He also arranged for his company to sponsor a scholarship for students pursuing aircraft maintenance and aviation engineering, explaining that skilled technicians deserved the same respect as executives. As he prepared to leave, Ethan noticed Lily waving from the hangar doorway. He waved back with a genuine smile. Driving away, he realized the most valuable lesson of the trip had not come from the business meeting he had rushed to attend. It had come from a hard-working single father who understood that true character is measured not by wealth, titles, or appearance, but by integrity, responsibility, and the quiet commitment to protect the lives of others every single day.